Hello, I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, back again for another round. So this one has the question posed at it, which is, should Canada become the 51st state of the United States of America? And I'll just cut to the chase and say, no, that's a ridiculous idea. But that's not the end of the video, obviously. I actually have some complex ideas on it for various reasons, which I'll get into. I will tell you specifically why it's a bad idea and why it's a worse idea than you might even think. So anyway, we'll get to that. The principal reason it's a bad idea is because Canadians don't want it. So that's it, really. I mean, that kind of cuts to the chase, isn't it? Like, if you held a referendum that was fair and true, joining the United States would fail massively, basically. And actually, if you want proof of that, you can see the fact that there is a general election campaign going on in Canada at the moment, and both parties, the Liberals and the Tories, in fact the Tories, if anything, are peddling harder than the Liberals on anti-Trump, pro-Canada nationalism stuff than even the Liberals are, because it's a bit of a weakness for the Conservatives, or at least it's perceived as such because of, again, the perceived closeness of centre-right parties throughout the West to Donald Trump. So it kind of tells you everything. No one in Canada is running on hey, let's join the US. It's not happening. It kind of tells you everything. But I think the biggest thing about it is it's really hard to understand the motivation for Trump in this. I mean, I've speculated on here before about, I made that video about, is Trump an imbecile? Like, in other words, is Trump doing this because he just completely misunderstands economics, or is he doing this for his own personal gain? For instance, has he just put the tariffs in to crash the market, then actually made a whole bunch of investments, when they're cheap and the market rises? Like, is it greed? I mean, I have no idea, but the point being is that you can make a case that that's a possibility. Whereas with the Canada thing, it makes no sense. It's really hard to get to an idea of how this can pay off for him, basically. Just really doesn't make sense. Or indeed America, but that kind of goes without saying. I mean, even the Greenland thing, you can sort of say, well, I guess he thinks Greenland's this and strategically this. I mean, it's still stupid, but I'm just saying it's not as stupid as the Canadian thing. Like, what's he going to do? Is he going to rack this up so that so America invades Canada at some point? I mean, that would be totally insane. It'd be right up there with, as insane a thing as anyone's ever done. I mean, we have to get into, like, Hitler here. Like, I mean, at least Hitler had, like, the most powerful, he had this idea that he could kind of take over Europe, and actually he came pretty damn close, whereas there's just no chance. I mean, does Trump have any idea how big Canada is? And if he wants to learn from Putin and lessons from that, I mean, invading Ukraine has been a disaster for Putin. Again, along the similar lines, a huge country, one that's extraordinarily cold at least half the year, I mean, really cold, like minus 30. I mean, mad. And so I think one thing to address right now, as some of you will know, some of you might not know, but I was born and raised in Canada by English expats, but nonetheless, that's where I grew up. And we were essentially, for all intents and purposes, an immigrant family. But the thing is, and people have speculated on this before about the degree to how I feel about Canada. And really, it was always kind of somewhere that I wanted to leave as a kid. I had this dream that when I grew up, I would move to London, and once I did that, my life would be magically better. I would have all these adventures. Straight off, I would meet all these amazing people. I would just be exponentially happier. And then when I was old enough, I did indeed move to England, and I discovered that my life did get magically better almost straight away. And I did meet loads of people and have loads of amazing adventures, and it was the best decision I ever made. So why is that, I guess, is the question. And I'll cover that briefly here. I think the best thing to talk about is the things about Canada that I didn't really like, I think that's fair to say. It wasn't somewhere I really ever felt like I fit in. And I think one of the problems was I think Canada much more than Britain, is it's harder to be someone that doesn't fit in. I think the British have a certain kind of viewpoint of different ideas, eccentricity even, that is, it's all that thing about like, you can be weird, but just don't scare the horses. There's a whole tradition within Britain, particularly England, around this. And they're really not in Canada. I mean, in Canada, my sense was that you just really needed to kind of toe the line. And if you didn't, you were just considered... I mean, I think in a sense, it wasn't just that you were considered weird or different or... you were actually almost considered stupid. Like there was a kind of, you must be a moron, because why can't you just, I don't know, be like everyone else? I think I need to address the weather. I did sort of briefly when I was talking about Trump invading, but the weather in a lot of Canada, not all of it, it depends. I mean, Vancouver is very temperate, but if you go in the middle of the country, it's insanely cold on a level that I think a lot of people don't really understand. When I first came to London, I hung out with a lot of people from Australia and New Zealand, and they said, oh, well, I know Canada's cold, but it can't be as cold as here. I think for a lot of people, there's no kind of idea of how cold is, really, unless you've experienced minus 30 for a month. You can't really picture it. And I remember people saying, well, but past a certain point, you can't really tell, can you? I mean, past minus 10, isn't it all the same? And I'm telling you that the difference between minus 20 and minus 10, it feels exactly, it's as much of a change as from 10 to 20. Like, as in, it's all linear. Like, minus 30 feels 30 degrees lower than 0. If you can picture that. Again, if you haven't experienced it, you can't, and I don't know what to tell you. But if you really want to, experience it, go for it. I think one of the things I'd like to go over here, and this will annoy some Canadians, but I think it's really important actually because, and it's not just a left-wing thing. It's not a liberal thing. Jordan Peterson had something the other day where he was talking about race relations, and I think he was basically trying to say that we've imported, Canada has imported race politics from America, and that's unhealthy, which I'm sure it is, so I'm not going to disagree with Peterson on that. But what I would disagree with is he said, well, we don't have any of that. There's no... Basically, he was trying to almost say, like, well, there's no racism in Canada, which I found kind of insane, because one of the big adjustments I had to make when I moved from Canada to England was how much less racist England was, how much less xenophobia it was. And seeing that in practice was, like, a real eye-opener. I think there was two forms of racism where I grew up, which was in the middle of the country, Alberta, which I think is worth discussing. One was the sort of open racism that I experienced growing up for South Asian people. So I mean people who are either first, second, third, whatever generation. Sorry about that. Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, people from that part of Asia. What in Britain would just be called Asian, but that actually has a different meaning in North America. When you say Asian in North America, people assume you mean East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, etc. Whereas in Britain, it just means that. So I mean that from now on, Asians. And I'm talking about like pretty brutal racism. And people will go, well, this was the 80s or the 90s, was a different time. But I moved to Manchester in the 90s. And I was really, it was amazing how much less racism there was. It was, every which way. In Alberta, people just threw the P word around, like with just nothing, like it was nothing. Like it was just a nothing thing to chuck that in there with casually with people you barely knew. And actually, it made the Asian population there quite defensive and it, frankly, a bit racist. So there was a huge amount of animus between Asians and white people in Canada where I grew up. And actually just coming to Manchester where that just didn't exist at all. Really didn't exist. Everybody was just in the pub together kind of drinking. And it was wonderful. It was lovely. But again, it's worth talking about because I think there's this idea about Canada where it's just this like... I think because it's compared to America, people just think it's this sort of, quote-unquote liberal paradise. And actually... lots of it isn't. But that's before we get into the real racism that I discovered, that I encountered in Canada growing up, which was towards the native population, the indigenous peoples of Canada. And I've really yet to see anything that was its equal anywhere in the world. I mean, I've seen racism against black people in America, and that can be brutal. That can be really, really awful when you see it firsthand. Really bad. But I would argue that the racism towards natives that I experienced in Alberta was genuinely worse. People would make viciously racist jokes about natives, and that was just considered completely fine. I mean, in an office setting, didn't matter, whatever. I remember actually being in an office, again, this would have been the early 90s, and someone came in and they made some joke about, it was essentially a joke about genocide of the natives, and everybody laughed and everybody thought it was great. And even the people who didn't laugh, no one thought, well, this is ridiculous and how dare someone do this. So it was pretty bad. But actually, the other thing about Alberta was there was a more generalized xenophobia, which was really based around, you would think, so where I was, there was essentially, people had only been there, like white people had only been there for like 100 years when I got there. Like at all. I mean, if you went back actually 100 years from when we moved there in the late 70s, kind of early 80s, basically white people had been there. I mean, if you went 100 years back, there was a fort where there were like 20 people. I mean, genuinely, that was what it was. So you would think that kind of from the outside, if you hadn't experienced it, everyone would just sort of be like, well, we're all mucking in together, we're all new here. But that's not how humans work. Basically, what you had is, it was that sort of narcissism of small differences. So if you'd been there 3 or 4 generations, it was like, no, we are the real people that are here, and you are the outsider, and you don't belong here. And that was, I felt, like a constant thing. And again, it was interesting. Like when I moved to England, my accent was incredibly, sort of Canadian, like I was incredibly Canadian sounding. And that got in my way sometimes, or certainly influenced the way people experienced it. But actually, in a way, I was experiencing less sort of outward xenophobia in spite of that. So it was very, very odd. Anyway, that's a roundabout way of just going over my background and the way I feel about Canada. I mean, essentially, I'm on Canada's side in the whole Trump thing. Of course I am. Because actually, I just think any logical person in the world sort of has to be. Even if you're American, I would argue that you sort of have to be. But when I'm defending it, when I'm saying, well, what Trump's doing in Canada is wrong, I feel exactly the same way I would do if Trump was doing that to New Zealand, let's say, which is a country I've never been to and have no connection at all to. It doesn't bring out any like special Canadian specific feelings in me. I guess I just sort of feel about Canada the way I felt for a very long time. And this is worth talking about. I mean, I was almost thinking about not bringing this up. But anyway, my wife does a quite a well listened to podcast on the Times Radio with Danny Finkelstein and Hugo Rifkind and Sally Morgan. And anyway, in it, she just mentioned, and I won't go into details of all of her comments, but she said that her husband, i.e. me, hates Canada. And actually, I think she said I have a visceral hate of Canada, which isn't true. It just isn't true. I think the truth is I don't like it. I just don't like it very much. But I want the Canadians to be free from Trump's madness. Of course I do. I like, my basic feeling is have your ice hockey, have your terrible weather, do it in freedom and joy, free from Trump's weirdness. I don't particularly want anything to do with it, and I never want to go to Canada again for any reason, but like that's just my own personal feeling on it, basically. And Trump invading would be terrible. And as I've mentioned before, actually, I think it would be terrible for Trump. It would be terrible for America. I mean, they would be bogged down there forever, and they would never win. Never, ever. I mean, the Canadians would never give up. Of course they wouldn't. It would never happen. And this whole thing about, like, well, the Canadian military is like 3 tanks and 5 guys, whatever. I mean, A, that's not true, but B, yes, America's military is much greater than Canada's, but so what? Actually, you've seen through history that it doesn't work. You're seeing it now in Ukraine. You actually can't defeat a country that just won't be defeated. It was like America and Vietnam. And Vietnam was much smaller geographically and should have been much more technically easy to invade than Canada, certainly in the 21st century. So it's just a road to nowhere, which I frankly don't understand. So coming back to the original question, should Canada become the 51st state? Well, let's steelman this just for a minute, right? What would Canada get out of this if it became the 51st state? Well, I suppose one of the things is, America is an incredible financial, powerhouse. Would Canada get some benefit out of that? Maybe. I mean, Canada's actually, and worth saying that Canada's been badly run for quite a while. And again, that's not a party political thing. That's not a slam at Trudeau. That's going back, that's conservative governments, that's liberal governments. They've been badly run for a really, really long time. I mean, Canada has consistently had worse, for instance, its growth is terrible. I mean, it's on par with a lot of European countries, but actually the lack of growth in European countries can at least be somewhat explained, because actually a lot of the problem with it never really recovered from the financial crash, and Europe has all sorts of structural problems, being a very old place and having very old infrastructure that has been hugely influential into why, for instance, it hasn't been able to replicate American levels of growth. But Canada, I mean, genuinely should have had at least comparable levels of growth to America, and it's nowhere near. It's like Germany's or France's or Spain's. I mean, Spain's growth is much better than Canada's. So anyway, that point aside, what I'm saying is actually it's been badly run. So could the idea that it could become American help that? Well, I mean, first thing to say is America currently is being very badly run. And actually, America arguably has been badly run for a while. It's just that for whatever reasons, it hasn't quite had the same deleterious effect that it has in, say, parts of Europe or Canada. But, I mean, you're rub against is the Canadians don't want American-style healthcare. No one does, by the way. No one in the West. I mean, anywhere in the West, you can just scare people immediately by saying such and such party wants to put in an American-style healthcare system. That instantly scares everybody, and it's terrifying. You're going to see it against Nigel Farage and Reform, for instance. Next general election, I guarantee it. Because people don't want that. People are terrified. People just, they don't want that. If you've had any form of socialized medicine, whatever state of dysfunction the system is in your country, people still, they're not going to, you're terrifying them if you're saying, like, suddenly you get ill, you're going to, like, sell your house. That will terrify people. And, again, won't work in Canada. So how would that work? And you couldn't, if we're going to have basically the Canadian nationalized health, socialized health, within the being part of the United States of America. So basically all the Americans could just come immediately and have free health care. I mean, it would be terrible for Canada, actually. All the young people would go to New York or Los Angeles, or Chicago or wherever. I mean, they go to the big cities and start businesses and do all the rest of that. And then basically all the old people who just wanted the free healthcare would come to Canada. So it would be terrible. It would be really, really bad. But again, it's not going to happen unless Trump invades Canada and somehow takes it over, which would be insane. It would be totally insane. Anyway, on that note, on that cheery, cheery, cheery note, thank you for joining me. I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. Please leave your comments below, particularly if you're an angry Canadian and you think anything I've said is incorrect, or indeed an angry American, or angry anything. Just leave me a note. Please like and subscribe this video if you haven't done already. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. Thank you, as always, to Bloomsbury Radio, the Bloomsbury Institute for hosting. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again.